We're going to argue that it's very important that there is an MDG on gender equality. That's the sense in which it's foundational. But we also have concerns about the nature of the indicator framework, and in this I don't think we're very different from people looking at other MDGs. And we want to review some of the arguments that are being made about the importance of furthering the indicators and expanding the notion of what it is that we're measuring. Angela's pointed at the dangers of the lack of coordinated action at the grassroots level, and that is going to be a theme we'll talk about as well. But it's also the danger of fracturing and the fragility of the MDG3 Alliance, particularly with regard to women's organizations and global feminist action. Gender equality MDG 3 was to report first. The first targets set for achievement in 2005 were the gender parity targets in education. But one of the first questions that tempered some of the aspiration that could accompany the MDGs was the notion of how limited a kind of concept gender parity was. And you'll see this in relation to education, when put side by side with the much larger demands for gender equality that had been formulated, particularly in the Beijing Platform for Action in 1995. So that gender parity, which is all it means, is that there are equal number of women and men at particular phases of education. Gender parity is so hollow a measure of gender equality that, as I acidly sometimes point out, there was gender parity in education in Afghanistan under the Taliban because only 3% of girls and 3% of boys were in school. The 2005 target, which was for gender parity in primary education and possibly in secondary education, was missed in 94 out of the 149 countries for which there was data. It was only achieved in 82 countries. The earth didn't move. Nobody made a big fuss. The problem with, you can raise two questions about this. Was it because it was about women? Was it because it was about primary education? Was it that gender just didn't light anybody's enthusiasm in 2005? But there wasn't even a newspaper headline. So that there's a question about, and I think that's a question for us in relation to this conference, assessing another midpoint, but this is a later midpoint. How urgently do people take their obligations in relation to the MDGs? As you can see from the figures, 2/3 of countries have achieved gender parity in primary education, 1/3 in secondary education, and only 5 countries in the world have achieved gender parity in tertiary education. The larger problem remains unlooked at, the problem of the very large number of adults who are illiterate, and that 2/3 of them are women. Here's the fourth indicator. The proportion of seats held by women in national parliaments. And this is derisory. We've all read many articles over the last few weeks about this, the significance of women's visibility in American politics over the presidential race. But it's ridiculous that a country which has had the vote and education for so long, that this is still an issue. And the numbers talk for themselves, and it's a depressing tale. Gender equality does entail more than parity and does entail more than the indicator framework provides for. And I think that's widely recognized. An influential World Bank paper has talked about the need to maybe develop what are called MDG 3 plus indicators. And these are the plus indicators. They relate to gender in primary school completion, under 5 mortality, whether or not girls and boys are engaged in the youth labour force and child labour, looking at gender in relation to pay, not just employment, because a lot of the expansion in women's employment has been in part-time and low-paid jobs. Also looking at use of contraception and the extent of underage pregnancy.
What Elaine wanted me to add to the talk was drawing on our work that we're doing at the Centre on Violence Against Women. And this is one of the issues that, if you look at the women's movement, has been something that's been very central. Has been a huge concern that actually unites the women's movement from industrialized to developing countries around the world. Is if you look at Beijing, the sort of common consensus that the women's movement could come up with was the urgent need to address women's risk of violence. And if you think about the underlying conceptualization of this MDG, it's about gender parity. And so if you think about violence against women, that is violence against women because of their sex, clearly that is a very explicit manifestation of gender inequality. And I think the concern with the MDG is actually when you start looking at this issue that's often very hidden, it's quite a stigmatized issue, when you start looking at the prevalence data, what it illustrates is actually how common a phenomena this is, and there's a concern that this MDG isn't really taking on board the underlying structural factors and issues around power and a lot of very political issues that allow these levels of violence to continue. And so here I'm just showing data from research that I've been doing with colleagues around the world and working with the World Health Organization, doing large household surveys on the levels of different forms of violence against women. And the figures here show the levels of violence, of physical or sexual violence against women by their partners. And what we find is that between 16 and 60% of women report ever being physically or sexually assaulted by their partners, with between 4% and 54% of women experiencing violence in the past year. So phenomenally high levels of violence, but also a huge degree of variation too. And I suppose that the tension with the MDG 3 is that actually this issue isn't coming up as part of the MDG debate. At the moment, while we're sitting here, there's a huge conference in South Africa, AWID conference of the Association of Women in Development. And a large issue on their agenda is these issues around violence against women, around things like women's legal rights, inheritance rights, women's ability to own land, to own property. And these things aren't featuring in the MDG debates adequately. At the AWID conference, there's not much discussion about women in education. And so the title of our talk is around fractures and tensions, because if you see actually who are the groups that probably who made sure that there was this MDG 3, it was the women's movement, it was the civil society. Yet, in the way that the MDG has been reflected in the sorts of indicators that are being used, actually they're picking up on very important issues, but also missing very important issues. And so it's a very fragile relationship that underpins this MDG.